A map is a promise. It's a declaration, inked in black on clean, pressed paper, that the world can be known, that it can be tamed by reason and line. It says, "Here be mountains, here be rivers, and here, if you follow my instructions, be salvation." For 20 years in the uniform of the United States Army, I lived by that promise. I marched by it, fought by it, and watched good men die by it. My name is Ezra Coleman, and in the summer of 1857, I was leading a different kind of company, a train of 10 wagons and 42 souls across the great alkali flats of the Nevada Territory. And I believed, with the certainty of a zealot, in the map spread across the seat of my wagon. It was a government survey, crisp and authoritative. It promised water at Crimson Creek, a 2-day ride from our current position. It was a promise I intended to keep. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the canvas tops of the wagons, bleaching the very color from the sky. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything: our clothes, our faces, the dry tongues in our mouths. It was a land that tolerated no mistakes. I'd made my share of those in the past, in places where the landscape was green, but the cost of error was just as high. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pricked at me. The hushed thunder of a canyon ambush, the misplaced faith in an order that led my patrol into a box of rock and rifle fire. I shook it off. That was then, this was now. This time, I was the one giving the orders. The plan was sound, the map was true. Discipline would see us through. My command was a civilian one now, but I ran it like a military column. We made camp and broke camp with brisk efficiency. Water was rationed with an iron fist. Grumbling was tolerated, but dissent was not. Most of the folks, farmers from Ohio, a blacksmith from Pennsylvania, families seeking a sliver of Eden in California, understood. They saw the harshness of the land and put their faith in me, in my experience. They saw the rigid set of my jaw and called it strength. They didn't see the ghost of a young corporal bleeding out in a ravine because I'd trusted a lieutenant's map over my gut. There was one member of our party, however, that cared not for my authority nor the elegant lines of my map. He was a horse. Not my own mount, a spirited mare named Bess, but the lead horse for the Miller family's heavy supply wagon. He was a rangy, dun-colored gelding, older than most, with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a deep and weary patience. He had no name that anyone used. He was just the Miller horse. And from the moment we left the last vestige of scrubland and entered the true desert, he had become a problem. It started subtly, a hesitation in his step, a tendency to pull against the line, his head turned slightly north, away from the westward path the map demanded. Old man Miller, a decent fellow with hands like worn leather, would curse and tug the reins. "Stubborn old mule," he'd mutter, and the horse would reluctantly fall back into line. I paid it little mind at first. Animals, like men, could be prone to moods and fatigue. A little persuasion, a firm hand was all that was required. But the horse's behavior grew more insistent. He'd stop dead in the tracks, planting his hooves and lowering his head, bringing the entire column to a halt. The air would fill with the creak of wood and the groans of the other animals, the impatient shouts of men. I'd ride back from the front, my face a mask of annoyance. "What is it now, Miller?" I'd ask, though I already knew. It was always the horse. Miller would be sweating, his face red with exertion and embarrassment. "He just stops, Mr. Coleman, won't budge." I'd dismount and approach the animal. I saw no sign of injury, no stone in his hoof. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon. A vast, shimmering emptiness that held nothing of interest according to my survey. I'd grab his bridle myself, my voice sharp with the authority I'd used on 1,000 green recruits. "Get on, you beast!" I put my shoulder into it, pulling with all my strength. He would resist for a long moment, a battle of wills played out under the silent judgment of the sun. Then, With a great, shuddering sigh that seemed to come from the very soul of him, he would yield. He would begin to walk again, but his reluctance was a palpable thing, a drag on the morale of the entire train. The other settlers watched these displays with a mixture of irritation and amusement. "That horse got a mind of its own," someone would say, and a few would chuckle. But I found no humor in it. It was a breakdown in discipline, an unpredictable variable in an equation that required absolute precision. He was a flesh and blood glitch in my otherwise perfect plan. Each time he stopped, each time he turned his head toward that barren expanse of nothing, he wasn't just defying Miller. He was questioning me. He was questioning my map. And in that silent, unforgiving wilderness, doubt was a contagion I could not afford to let spread. I made a mental note to have a firm word with Miller that evening. If he couldn't control his animal, we might have to make a change. The progress of the column was paramount. The promise of the map had to be kept, no matter the stubbornness of one dumb animal. That evening, the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the western sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. The heat still radiated from the packed earth, a constant, oppressive presence. We circled the wagons not out of fear of attack. Out here, we were the only fools for 100 miles. But for the simple comfort of creating a temporary home in the vast emptiness. The smell of bacon grease and boiling coffee cut through the dust, small rituals of civilization against the encroaching wilderness. I did my rounds, checking on the families, inspecting the water levels in the barrels, my face set in the grim, reassuring lines of command. I found Jedediah Miller sitting by his wagon, mending a piece of harness. His son, a quiet boy of about 10 named Thomas, sat nearby, watching the dun horse. The animal stood apart from the others, not grazing on the sparse, dry clumps of grass, but staring out into the deepening twilight, his head still oriented to the north. "Miller," I said, my voice low but firm, "we need to talk about your horse." Jedediah looked up, his brow furrowed with worry. "I know, Mr. Coleman. I swear, I don't know what's gotten into him. He's never been like this. Pulled a plow for 5 years straight without a single complaint." "This isn't a field in Ohio," I stated flatly. "Out here, insubordination can get people killed. He holds up the train. He wastes daylight. He's becoming a liability." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Jedediah looked down at his hands, at the worn leather strap. "I've tried everything. The whip don't even move him much. It's like he's seeing something we ain't." From the shadows, the boy Thomas spoke up, his voice barely a whisper. "He smells the wind." I turned to the boy. He was small for his age, with wide, serious eyes that seemed to take everything in. He wasn't looking at me, but at the horse. "What did you say, son?" "He puts his nose up and smells the wind," Thomas repeated, a little louder this time. "And he watches the birds, the little brown ones. They fly north in the morning. He watches them." I felt a flash of irritation. Sentimental nonsense. "He's an animal, boy. He's tired and thirsty, that's all. He needs a firm hand, not poetry." I turned back to Jedediah. "See that he gets it. I want to make Crimson Creek by tomorrow evening. That means no delays. Understood?" "Yes, Mr. Coleman," Jedediah said, his shoulders slumping. I walked away, satisfied that I had made my point, but the boy's words echoed in my mind. He smells the wind. It was the kind of thinking that got men killed, attributing human reason to dumb beasts, looking for omens in the sky instead of trusting the hard-won science of cartography. It was the opposite of everything I had built my life upon. Reason, logic, the tangible proof of ink on paper. The next day was worse. The sun seemed to have a personal malevolence. The heat shimmered off the salt-crusted ground, creating mirages of cool blue lakes that dissolved into dust upon approach. The dun horse's resistance was no longer passive. He actively fought Jedediah, pulling the heavy wagon several degrees off course to the north, forcing the other teams to adjust and creating a chaotic, snaking line. Shouts of frustration echoed across the flats. Twice I had to ride back and physically help wrestle the animal back onto the westward bearing. His skin was slick with sweat, his eyes rolling, but his strength was immense. It was a brute contest of will, and while I won each time, the victories felt hollow. The horse's silent, desperate insistence was unnerving. He wasn't being lazy. He was trying to tell us something, and the sheer animal certainty of it was a direct affront to my own. During our midday stop, a brief respite in the slivers of shade cast by the wagons, I saw Thomas approach the horse. The boy held out a cupped hand with a small portion of his own water ration. The horse, who had been agitated just moments before, grew calm. He drank gently from the boy's hand, his large, soft lips brushing the child's skin. Then he nudged the boy's shoulder with his head, a gesture of profound gentleness. Sarah, Thomas's mother, called out, her voice sharp with worry. "Thomas, get away from that beast, and don't you be wasting your water." But I saw something else. I saw a connection, a silent communication that I could not parse. The boy wasn't afraid. He stood there, his small hand stroking the horse's dusty neck, whispering things I couldn't hear. The horse, in turn, stood perfectly still, his earlier panic gone, replaced by that same weary patience I'd seen before. It was as if, in the boy, the horse had found its only ally. That afternoon, the horse's agitation returned, but with a new dimension. He began to paw at the ground, a deep, rhythmic scraping that sent up puffs of fine white dust. He'd walk a few paces, then stop and paw again, always facing north. "He's gone mad," muttered one of the men, a blacksmith named Peterson. "The heat's cooked his brain." "Maybe he smells water," another suggested, a hopeful note in his voice. I shut that down immediately. "There is no water to the north," I declared, my voice ringing with an authority I was beginning to feel slip. I unfolded the map, though I knew it by heart. "Look, it's nothing but the Black Rock Desert, miles of it. Crimson Creek is west. That is our only source of water. That is our only path. Now let's get moving." But as I mounted Bess, I couldn't shake the image of the horse pawing at the bone-dry earth. It was an act of pure, unreasoning instinct. And as we forced him back into line, as his hooves stopped their frantic digging and reluctantly followed the path I had decreed, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the cold, quiet ghost of a question. What if the map is wrong? I crushed it before it could take root. To even consider it was to invite chaos. The plan was the only thing holding us together. It had to be right. The third day in the flats was the day the hope began to sour. The promise of Crimson Creek, which had been a comforting beacon on the horizon of our minds, started to feel like one of the shimmering mirages that teased us from a distance. The landscape had not changed in the slightest. It was a panorama of baked earth and sky, relentless and unchanging. The sun rose with a white-hot intensity and set without relief. Our water was getting low, dangerously low. My initial calculations, based on the map's mileage and a standard consumption rate, had been precise, but my calculations hadn't accounted for this level of heat, for the way the sun leached the moisture from our bodies with such vicious efficiency. The canvas covers of the barrels, meant to slow evaporation, were bone dry. When we tilted the casks to fill the canteens, the sloshing sound within was shallow, a hollow echo of our dwindling reserves. I ordered the ration cut in half. A cup in the morning, a cup at midday, and a cup in the evening. The grumbling that had been a low murmur now became an open current of anxiety. I saw it in the pinched faces of the women and the hard stares of the men. They looked at their children, at their cracked, sunburnt lips, and then they looked at me. Their faith, once a solid thing I could stand upon, was turning to dust, just like the ground beneath our feet. "Mr. Coleman," said Peterson, the blacksmith, approaching me as I consulted my compass for the 100th time. He was a large man, but the desert was shrinking him. His voice was raspy. "Are you sure about this creek? Seems we should have reached it by now." "The map says it's 5 miles ahead," I said, pointing westward with a confidence I did not feel. "The terrain is deceptive. It makes distances seem longer. We hold the course." "The animals are failing," he pressed, gesturing to a pair of oxen standing with lowered heads, their flanks heaving. "They won't last another day without a real drink, and neither will we." "Fear will kill you faster than thirst, Peterson," I snapped, my own nerves fraying. "We maintain discipline. We follow the plan. That is how we survive." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a desperate, angry doubt. He wanted a miracle from me. I had only a map. He turned and walked away without another word, but his message had been delivered. My authority, my entire leadership, was balanced on the promise of water just over the next rise. The Miller horse seemed to feel the growing desperation. His protests were no longer about direction, they were about stopping. He would simply refuse to pull, his body rigid, his breath coming in shallow pants. Jedediah had given up on the whip. He now stood beside the horse, pleading with it, trying to coax it forward with gentle words and a soft hand on its muzzle. It was a pathetic sight, a man begging a beast to walk toward its own demise. The rest of us would wait, our throats too dry for shouting, our bodies too weary for anger. We just stood in the oppressive silence, listening to the sound of our own labored breathing. It was during one of these forced halts that the first person fell. It was an elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, traveling with her son's family. She had seemed frail from the start, but her spirit had been strong. Now, that spirit was broken. She was sitting on the tailgate of their wagon and simply toppled over, landing in the dust with a soft, final thud. The cry from her daughter-in-law was a ragged tear in the fabric of the afternoon. We rushed to her side. Her eyes were glassy, her skin pale and clammy despite the heat. Her pulse was a faint, frantic flutter beneath my fingers. Dehydration. We forced a few precious drops of water between her lips, but it was too late. She murmured something about a green field and a cool stream, and then she was gone. We buried her there, in that God-forsaken wasteland. The men took turns with the shovels, their movements slow and heavy. The ground was hard as iron, and the shallow grave felt like a profound insult to a long life. We stood over the small mound of displaced earth, a silent, grim circle of survivors. There were no prayers said. What was there to say? God felt very far away. The death of Mrs. Gable was a tipping point. The fragile bonds of our small society began to fray. Later that day, I caught a man, one of the younger farmhands, trying to steal water from the central reserve barrel. I grabbed him and threw him against a wagon wheel, my face inches from his. His eyes were wild with panic. "You steal water? You steal life," I snarled, my voice a raw whisper. "You condemn us all. Is that what you want?" He started sobbing, a pathetic, broken sound. "My wife, she's sick." I felt no pity, only a cold, hard rage. We are all sick. We are all thirsty. The only thing that separates us from animals is order. I pushed him away in disgust. The next person who tries this will be left behind. I swear it. My threat worked. The fear of exile was greater, for now, than the fear of thirst. But as I turned away, I saw the looks on their faces. They weren't looking at me as a leader anymore. They were looking at me as a tyrant, a man who would sacrifice them for the lines on his precious map. And in the center of it all, the dun horse stood watching, his head low as if in mourning. He hadn't moved an inch during the entire ordeal. He just stood, a silent witness to our slow, agonizing disintegration. The promise of the map was turning into a death warrant. The day after we buried Mrs. Gable, a kind of numb despair settled over the train. The sun rose, and we yoked the animals and we walked, but it was the motion of automatons. The talk had ceased. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the dry, rasping coughs that seemed to pass from one person to another. Crimson Creek was no longer a certainty. It was a prayer whispered on parched lips, and faith was in short supply. I rode at the head of the column, my back straight, trying to project a confidence that was nothing more than a hollow shell. Every rise I crested revealed the same thing, more of the same endless, cracked plain. The map was still on the seat beside me, but I avoided looking at it. To look at it felt like looking at the face of a liar. The ghost of that canyon ambush returned, stronger this time. I could almost smell the gunpowder, hear the screams of my men. I had followed orders then. I was following the map now. The thought that they might be one and the same, two different forms of a fatal blindness, was a heresy I fought to suppress. Young Thomas Miller was suffering badly. The boy had given his water to the horse, an act of compassion that was now costing him dearly. He stumbled alongside his family's wagon, his face flushed, his eyes glazed over. His mother, Sarah, watched him with a hawk-like terror, her own face a mask of grief. Around noon, when the sun was at its most pitiless, the boy fell. He didn't cry out. He just crumpled, a small, limp heap in the dust. Sarah screamed. Jedediah rushed to his side, lifting him into the shade beneath the wagon. The boy was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. "He needs water!" Sarah cried, her voice cracking. "Ezra, for the love of God, give him some water!" I hesitated. It was a terrible calculus. Giving the boy an extra ration meant taking it from someone else. It meant breaking my own rigid rule. It meant admitting that the plan was failing, that my discipline was not enough. As I stood frozen by this awful dilemma, something else happened. The dun horse, which had been standing listlessly in its harness, suddenly came alive. With a violent heave, he snapped the worn leather trace connecting him to the wagon yoke. The crack of the braking strap was like a pistol shot in the silence. Before Jedediah could react, the horse was free. He wasn't frantic or wild. He moved with a strange, deliberate purpose. He trotted a few paces away from the trail, directly north, and then stopped, turning his head to look back at the wagon where the boy lay. He let out a soft whinny, a sound that was less a call and more an invitation. Then he turned and began to walk north, into the shimmering heat. "Get him back!" I yelled, jolted into action. "He's our only draft horse left for that wagon!" Jedediah and another man started after him, but they were slow and weary. The horse maintained a steady pace, staying just out of their reach. He'd stop, wait for them to get close, and then move on again. It was maddening. Then the boy, Thomas, stirred. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes fixed on the departing horse. "Buck," he whispered, his voice a dry croak. It was the first time I'd heard anyone give the animal a proper name. The horse stopped again, about 50 yards out, and pawed at the ground. Once, twice. He looked back directly at the boy. It was the most intelligent and communicative gesture I had ever seen from an animal. It was a summons. "Stay here," Jedediah shouted back at his son. But the boy, with a surge of strength that seemed impossible, scrambled to his feet. He began to stumble after the horse, his small legs unsteady, his arms outstretched. "Buck!" he called again, louder this time. Sarah screamed his name, but she was too weak to run after him. I spurred my mare, Bess, intending to cut the boy off, to bring him back to the relative safety of the wagon's shade. But as I drew alongside him, the horse, Buck, let out another whinny and began to trot further on, leading the boy away from us. I had a choice: grab the boy and let the horse go for good, or follow them both into the empty expanse my map swore was lifeless. Something in the certainty of the horse, in the desperate faith of the boy, made my decision. "Stay with the wagons," I yelled over my shoulder. "I'll bring them back." I followed them. It was only a few hundred yards, but it felt like miles. Buck led us to a shallow depression in the earth, a place barely distinguishable from the rest of the flats, marked only by a cluster of withered, salt-encrusted bushes. He stopped there and began to dig at the ground with his front hoof, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a knowing insistence. I dismounted as Thomas reached the spot and fell to his knees. I expected nothing. Dust, dry pebbles, but where the horse had scraped away the top layer of baked earth, the ground was dark. It was damp. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped to my knees beside the boy, my hands scrabbling at the ground. It was mud. Cool, thick mud. We dug with our bare hands, clawing at the earth like desperate animals. And then we saw it. A tiny pool of brackish, muddy water, seeping up from some hidden place deep within the earth. It wasn't a spring. It was barely a puddle. But it was water. Thomas plunged his face into it, drinking greedily. I didn't stop him. I scooped the silty liquid into my own hands, letting it run over my face, into my mouth. It tasted of salt and earth, the most wonderful taste I had ever known. We drank until our bellies ached. Buck lowered his own great head and drank alongside us, his soft muzzle bumping against our shoulders. It wasn't enough for the whole train, not even close. It was a reprieve, not a salvation. But as I looked from the revived boy to the calm, knowing eyes of the horse, I could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. This animal had known. He had led us here. He had saved this boy's life. He had defied my map and, for a moment, proven it wrong. It was a small mercy, but it was enough to shatter the foundation of my certainty. For the first time, I looked at the vast, empty desert not as a problem to be solved by logic, but as a place of secrets, a place with a language I did not understand. Returning to the wagon train with a revived Thomas and 2 full canteens of the muddy water felt less like a triumph and more like a complication. The water, a symbol of hope, was also a source of bitter conflict. We gave it to the sickest first, Sarah Miller, another young mother, and one of the older men, but the few swallows they received only sharpened the thirst of the others. The sight of it, the knowledge that there was more out there, however little, bred a desperate, resentful energy. "Why can't we all go?" Peterson demanded, his voice thick with accusation. "Why does the Miller boy get saved while our children suffer?" "It's barely a seep," I explained, my patience worn thin. "There's not enough for everyone. To move the whole train would be a waste of energy we don't have. We stick to the main route. Crimson Creek is still our best hope." I sounded like a fool, even to myself. My words were a hollow recitation of a faith I no longer fully possessed. The people stared at me, their faces a mixture of contempt and despair. I had led them to this point, and my only answer was to keep walking the same path that was killing them. The little bit of water Buck had found served only to highlight my failure. We pressed on. The dun horse, Buck, was yoked back to the wagon, but something had changed. The men looked at him differently now. Not as a stubborn beast, but with a flicker of awe, of superstitious respect. Jedediah no longer used the reins to command, but to gently guide. And the horse, for his part, walked with a new reluctance, as if he knew he was being led away from life and toward a dead end. By late afternoon, the world began to change. It was a subtle shift, one I might have missed if I hadn't been so unnerved by the day's events. The oppressive, direct heat of the sun lessened, replaced by a suffocating, humid stillness. The air grew thick, heavy. The sky, which had been a relentless pale blue, took on a hazy, yellowish tint. Far on the horizon, the dust devils that had been dancing all day seemed to collapse in on themselves and disappear. The insects, the constant buzzing chorus of the desert, fell silent. It was an unnatural quiet, a held breath. I had seen skies like this before, in the Badlands of the Dakota Territory. It was a weather sign, but one my training had no name for. My instinct, a thing I had long learned to suppress, screamed that something was wrong. I felt it then, a primal dread that had nothing to do with thirst. The wind was picking up, not a cooling breeze, but a hot, gritty gust that whipped at our clothes and stung our eyes. It was coming from the west, the direction we were heading. My mind raced. The map showed nothing. My compass gave me a bearing, but it couldn't tell me what was riding on that wind. The logical part of my brain, the commander, argued for pushing on. Shelter was an unknown. Crimson Creek was a known objective. To turn back was to lose precious ground, to give in to animal panic. It was a failure of nerve. But the memory of the muddy seep, of the boy's revived face, was a powerful counter-argument. The horse had been right once. What if he was right again? The settlers were looking to me, their faces pale with a new kind of fear. They weren't thirsty anymore. They were scared. They were children in the dark, and I was supposed to be the one who held the candle. "It's just the wind," I said aloud, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I was saying it as much to convince myself as them. "We're exposed here. Our best chance is to keep moving. Find the creek bed. It will offer some protection." It was a catastrophic miscalculation. I chose the promise of the map over the evidence of my own senses and the frantic warning of the one creature who was actually reading the world around us. I was a commander giving an order that would lead his troops into another ambush, this one orchestrated not by men, but by nature itself. "Forward!" I commanded, my voice louder than necessary, drowning out the rising howl of the wind and the clamor of my own doubt. "Keep the column tight! Westward!" Jedediah fought to turn Buck, who was now rearing in his harness, his powerful body slick with sweat and fear. The horse seemed to understand what I had just done. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not just terror, but an accusation. He knew we were walking into the jaws of a monster, and my arrogance was leading the way. With a final, desperate pull from Jedediah and a crack of the whip from another man, Buck was forced to turn his back on the safety of the rocks and face the oncoming storm. The storm did not arrive. It fell upon us. One moment we were marching against a hard, grit-filled wind. The next, the yellowish sky vanished, replaced by a solid, churning wall of brown. It was as if the desert itself had risen up to swallow us whole. The sun was extinguished. Day turned to a suffocating, terrifying twilight. The sound was a physical assault, a deafening roar that was part wind, part grinding sand. It was impossible to speak, impossible to hear anything but the elemental fury of the storm. Sand, driven with the force of shotgun pellets, scoured our exposed skin, forced its way into our eyes, our noses, our mouths. Breathing became a conscious, painful act of inhaling grit. The world devolved into pure chaos. The oxen, blind and terrified, bellowed and strained against their yokes, some trying to bolt, others simply collapsing where they stood. The wagons, which had been our homes and our fortresses, became deadly, unmanageable beasts. The wind caught their canvas tops like sails, threatening to tip them, their great wheels skidding sideways in the loose, shifting ground. I lost sight of the column almost instantly. I was only yards away from the lead wagon, but it was completely invisible in the swirling maelstrom. I pulled my hat down, tied my bandana over my nose and mouth, and leaned low over Bess's neck, trusting her to keep her footing. The wind screamed in my ears, a high, thin sound like the souls of the damned. Through the brown haze, I caught nightmarish glimpses of the disintegration. I saw a wagon cover rip from its moorings and vanish into the sky like a giant, pale ghost. I saw Peterson, the blacksmith, a mountain of a man, knocked from his feet as if swatted by an invisible hand. I saw Sarah Miller desperately clinging to the side of her wagon, trying to shield young Thomas from the worst of the blast. My own meticulously organized world, my straight, disciplined line, had been obliterated in seconds. The map was gone, plucked from the wagon seat and sent tumbling into the vortex. My compass was a useless trinket. All my plans, all my certainties, were buried under an avalanche of sand. I fought to keep Bess's head pointed into the wind, the only rational action I could think of. To turn would be to get blown over. We took it step by agonizing step, the sand piling up around her legs like a monstrous brown snowdrift. Time ceased to have meaning. It was an eternity of roaring wind and stinging darkness. There was a sudden, splintering crash nearby. I turned toward the sound and saw a horrifying silhouette. The miller's wagon, the one pulled by Buck, had been caught by a massive gust. It tilted, balanced on two wheels for a heart-stopping second, and then went over with a groan of tortured wood, spilling its contents, barrels, crates, the meager possessions of a family, onto the desert floor. I spurred Bess forward, my heart seizing with dread. I found Jedediah on his knees, dazed, with a bleeding cut on his forehead. Sarah was a few feet away, trying to push herself up. "Thomas!" she shrieked, her voice swallowed by the storm. "My boy!" He was nowhere to be seen. He must have been thrown when the wagon tipped. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my own fear. I dismounted, yelling his name, my voice a pathetic croak against the gale. And then I saw the horse. Buck had been thrown to the ground when the wagon overturned, tangled in his harness. But he had struggled to his feet, and he was not trying to run. He was standing over a small shape curled on the ground. He had positioned his body to shield it from the main force of the wind, his head lowered, his powerful frame taking the brunt of the sandy assault. It was Thomas. I scrambled over to them. The boy was conscious, terrified but unharmed. The horse's body had acted as a living wall, saving him from being battered or buried. As I reached for the boy, the great animal turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and full of pain, but they held no panic, only a deep, stoic endurance. He had tried to warn me. He had tried to lead us to shelter. I had ignored him, and this was the price. And still, in the midst of the chaos I had doomed us to, he was doing what a true leader does, protecting the weakest among us. I gathered the boy into my arms and huddled with his parents behind the bulk of the fallen horse. There was nothing more to do. No orders to give, no path to follow. We were just 3 terrified adults and 1 small boy, sheltering behind a dumb animal in a world that had come undone. The storm raged on, burying our path, burying our supplies, burying my arrogance under the suffocating weight of the sand. We could only wait and pray that the world would not forget us there. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. The roaring wind didn't die down, it simply ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt louder than the gale itself. A pale, dust-choked light filtered through the haze, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Our world had been erased and redrawn. The landscape was a series of smooth, undulating dunes of sand that hadn't been there hours before. The trail was gone. All familiar landmarks were gone. It was like waking up on a different planet. The air was thick with fine dust that coated the back of the throat and made every breath a gritty effort. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the brown twilight, like ghosts rising from the earth. People pushed themselves up from where they had huddled behind dead oxen or the wreckage of wagons. They were coated head to foot in a uniform layer of pale dust, their faces barely recognizable. We were a company of clay figures blinking in the alien light. I took a head count. Miraculously, everyone was alive. Battered, bruised, and terrified, but alive. The overturned wagon had been the worst of the structural damage, but 2 other wagons had lost their canvas tops, their contents exposed and half buried. Several of the oxen were dead, their great bodies already being covered by the shifting sands. The material losses were catastrophic, but it was the psychological toll that was worse. I looked at their faces. The discipline I had worked so hard to instill was gone. The trust they had placed in me was shattered. In its place was a raw, accusing fear. Peterson, the blacksmith, was the first to give it voice. He staggered toward me, his face a mask of fury. "You!" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "You did this! The horse knew! The animal knew, and you marched us straight into hell!" Heads turned. Others began to murmur their agreement. "We should have turned back," a woman cried. "We should have listened." "My children could have died," another man shouted, jabbing a finger in my direction. "Because of your damn maps!" I stood my ground, but I had no defense. They were right. My pride, my stubborn refusal to consider any wisdom but my own, had led them here. The ghost of the canyon ambush was no longer a whisper. It was a full-throated scream in my soul. I was that young corporal again, watching my men die. But this time, I was also the arrogant lieutenant who had sent them there. "Panicking will not help us," I said, my voice sounding weak and hollow. "We need to assess our situation, find what water we have left, and figure out our position." "Our position?" Peterson laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "We're in the middle of nowhere. We're lost. And you, the great leader, you have no idea where we are, do you?" He was right about that, too. I pulled the compass from my pocket. The needle spun lazily, then settled. It gave me north, but what good was north without a map, without a known starting point? The sun was a diffuse white glow behind the haze, offering no clear direction. We were adrift in a sea of sand. The settlers began to argue amongst themselves. Some wanted to backtrack, to try and find the rock shelter the horse had pulled toward. Others argued for pushing west, believing, out of sheer desperate hope, that Crimson Creek must still be close. The fragile community I had commanded had devolved into a panicked mob, each person clinging to their own fearful, uninformed opinion. In the midst of the human chaos, the animals were quiet. My mare, Bess, stood with her head low. The remaining oxen were passive, too exhausted to move. And then there was Buck. Jedediah had untangled him from the broken harness. The horse stood free, shaking the thick layer of dust from his coat. He seemed tired, but unharmed. He ignored the frantic arguments of the humans. Instead, he walked slowly to where Thomas was sitting beside his mother. He nudged the boy's hand with his nose, a quiet gesture of reassurance. The boy, in turn, wrapped his arms around the horse's neck. "It's okay, Buck," he whispered into the animal's dusty mane. "It's okay." Watching them, a strange calm settled over me. All my systems, my logic, my authority, had failed. The arguments of the settlers were just noise, the frightened babbling of lost children. But the horse was not lost. He stood there, a solid, living thing in the midst of the wreckage, and he was not afraid. He was simply present. He was watching, waiting, listening to the world in a way none of us knew how to do. The arguing died down as the people noticed my gaze. They all turned to look at the horse and the boy. In the unsettling silence of the storm's aftermath, that simple image, a child finding comfort in the animal that had tried to save them, was more powerful than any order I could give or any argument Peterson could make. The question of our survival no longer seemed to rest on me. It had shifted. It now stood on 4 steady hooves, its patient eyes surveying a world that had wiped us clean from its slate. Dawn the next day brought a terrible clarity. The dust had settled overnight, revealing a sky of piercing, indifferent blue. The sun began its ascent, promising a day of heat that would be unbearable without adequate water. Our survey of the supplies confirmed our worst fears. Several water barrels had been cracked in the storm, their precious contents swallowed by the sand. We had, by my estimation, enough water for 2 days, maybe 3 if we were motionless. But to stay here was to die. We had to move. The question was, where? The argument from the previous evening resumed with a grim, desperate intensity. Peterson's faction, emboldened by my failure, argued for heading east. "The rock shelter," he insisted, his voice raspy. "It's our only chance. We backtrack. It can't be more than a few hours' walk." Another man, a farmer named Cole, pointed west. "That's foolishness. We were almost at the creek. We have to be. To turn back now is to give up. Our only hope is forward." They looked to me, not for leadership, but as a tiebreaker, a final arbiter for their desperate gamble. I stood apart from them, the useless compass in my hand. East was the past, a known point of safety we had forsaken. West was the future, the promise of the map that had proven to be a lie. Both directions were an act of faith, and my own faith was broken. My past command failure washed over me with the force of a physical blow. The ambush in the canyon. Lieutenant Davies, fresh from West Point, his map pristine, his confidence absolute. He had pointed. "The pass is here, Corporal Coleman. Secure it." My gut had screamed no. The silence was wrong. The rocks held too many shadows. But I was a corporal. I followed orders. I led my men into the kill box. Davies died. 3 of my men died. I survived, with a chest full of shrapnel and a soul full of ghosts. I had sworn, in that bloody ravine, that I would never again follow a path that felt wrong, no matter who drew the map. And yet, here I was. I had become Davies. "We will go west," I said, my voice a hollow shell of my former authority. It was the choice that required the least explanation, the one that clung to the shredded remnants of the original plan. It felt wrong. It felt like marching back into the canyon. A few nodded grimly. Peterson and his followers cursed under their breath. The decision was made. We would walk toward a phantom creek, toward the lie that had stranded us here. The men began the slow, arduous work of righting the miller's wagon and redistributing the loads. We had to abandon one wagon entirely, leaving it half buried in the sand like a wooden tombstone. The mood was sullen, hopeless. We were a funeral procession for ourselves. When the time came to move, Jedediah took up his position by Buck, who had been harnessed to the now lightened wagon. The settlers fell into a ragged line behind him. I mounted Bess and moved to the front. "All right," I called out, trying to muster some semblance of command. "Let's move." I nudged Bess forward. The other animals, prodded by their owners, began to walk. The wagons creaked. The line began its slow, westward march. All except one. The Miller wagon did not move. Buck had not taken a single step. He stood with his legs braced, his head low, a statue of absolute refusal. "Come on, boy! Hyah!" Jedediah urged, pulling on the bridle. The horse didn't even twitch. Peterson strode over, a long whip in his hand. "I'll get the stubborn beast moving." He brought the whip down with a sharp crack on the horse's flank. Buck shuddered at the impact, a ripple of muscle and skin. But he did not move. His feet were rooted to the earth. Peterson struck him again, harder this time, and again. The sound was ugly in the quiet air. Sarah Miller cried out, "Stop it! You're hurting him!" Thomas ran to the horse's head, wrapping his arms around his neck as if to protect him. "Leave him alone," the boy sobbed. I dismounted and walked back, a cold fury building inside me. "That's enough, Peterson," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "He's holding us up," the blacksmith raged. "We need to move." And I said, "That's enough." I stood between him and the horse. We stared at each other, two men at the breaking point. The rest of the settlers watched, their faces drawn and anxious. This was more than an animal's stubbornness. This was a reckoning. I turned to the horse. Buck stood impassively, his breathing steady. He ignored the man with the whip, the crying child, the desperate adults. He was looking north. His gaze was fixed on that empty horizon with the same unwavering certainty he had shown from the very beginning. In that moment, everything crystallized. The map, Lieutenant Davies, the canyon, the sandstorm, the water seep. It was all one long, brutal lesson that I had refused to learn. I had been given chance after chance to listen, to trust something other than the flawed, arrogant reason of men. Here was my final choice. I could force the issue. We could beat the horse, try to drag the wagon, assert the last vestiges of my broken authority, and march us all to our deaths in the West. Or I could surrender. I could make the choice I failed to make in that canyon 10 years ago. I could abandon the map for good. I looked at the faces of the people watching me. They were no longer a column to be commanded. They were a flock I had led astray. I looked at the boy, his face buried in the horse's mane, and I looked at the horse, at his calm, patient, knowing eyes. My shoulders, which had been squared with the rigid posture of a soldier for 20 years, finally slumped. I walked to the front of the horse. I reached out and took the reins from Jedediah's hands. Then, in an act of unconditional surrender, I let them drop into the dust. I looked at Buck. "All right," I said, my voice not much more than a whisper. "Where do we go?" The moment the reins fell from my hand, a profound silence descended upon our small, ragged group. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world tilting on its axis. Peterson stared at me, his mouth agape, the whip hanging uselessly at his side. The other settlers exchanged wide-eyed, uncertain glances. They had witnessed not just an act of desperation, but a complete abdication of the authority they had, until now, relied upon. I had officially relinquished command to a horse. I stood before the animal, my arms limp at my sides. The weight of leadership, a burden I had carried for so long it felt like a part of my own spine, was gone. In its place was a terrifying, liberating emptiness. I was no longer the guide. I was just another lost soul, placing my life and the lives of 40 others into the care of a creature who could not speak, who could only know. For a long moment, Buck did nothing. He simply stood there, his large, dark eyes watching me. It felt like a test. He seemed to be waiting to see if my surrender was genuine. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air whistling softly in his great nostrils. He blinked, slowly. Then he took a step. It was not west, it was not east. It was north. He moved with no hesitation, his stride steady and purposeful. He began to walk, and the Miller wagon, with Jedediah holding loosely to the harness and Thomas walking by the horse's head, creaked into motion behind him. He was leading us directly away from the path of the map, away from the direction of California, into an expanse of desert that, according to every rational measure, was a death trap. "Coleman, have you lost your mind?" Peterson sputtered, finding his voice. "You're going to let that animal lead us to our doom?" I turned to face him, to face all of them. I felt strangely calm. The ghosts that had haunted me were quiet for the first time in years. His instincts have been right more often than my maps, I said, my voice even. He tried to warn us of the storm. He found water when I said there was none. I ignored him and nearly got us all killed. I won't make that mistake again. But there's nothing out there, Cole the farmer protested, waving a hand at the empty northern horizon. Maybe, I replied. And maybe there's nothing to the west either. The creek was a lie. The map was a lie. All I know is that this animal wants to go this way with a certainty I haven't felt since we left the green hills of Missouri. I am going to follow him. I turned and began to walk after the wagon. I didn't look back to see if they would follow. My decision was made. If I had to walk into that wasteland alone, I would. For a few moments, the only sounds were the creak of the Miller wagon's wheels and the soft thud of Buck's hooves in the sand. Then, I heard other sounds. The shuffling of feet, the low murmur of voices, the creak of another wagon. I glanced over my shoulder. One by one, family by family, they were falling in line behind me. Sarah Miller, her face etched with a desperate hope, urged her husband's team forward. The family who had lost their grandmother, Mrs. Gable, followed suit. Even Cole, the farmer who had argued for the West, reluctantly turned his oxen north. Peterson was the last. He stood for a full minute, a solitary, defiant figure, staring after our departing column. He looked west, then north, his powerful body torn by indecision. Finally, with a curse that was carried away by the breeze, he shouldered his rifle and began to trudge after us. A man joining a fool's pilgrimage because the alternative, to be left alone, was even more terrifying. We were a strange procession, a train of battered wagons and weary people being led into the unknown by a nameless dun horse, followed by a disgraced commander who had finally learned the meaning of humility. The sun beat down, but the journey felt different. The desperate, frantic energy of our westward march was gone. In its place was a slow, patient rhythm, set not by my watch, but by the steady, unhurried pace of the animal in the lead. I walked instead of riding, letting my mare Bess trail behind me. I wanted to feel the ground beneath my feet. I wanted to see the world from this new perspective. For the first time, there was no destination on a map, no calculated mileage to cover before dusk. The only objective was to put one foot in front of the other, to trust the quiet wisdom of the creature walking ahead of us. It was an act of pure, terrifying faith. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I looked at the vast, featureless landscape ahead, and I did not feel dread. I felt a strange and unfamiliar peace. I had finally let go of the map. Now, all I could do was follow. The journey north was a lesson in a new kind of hardship, the hardship of uncertainty. Our previous march to the west had been brutal, but it had a clear, if false, objective. We were always going somewhere. Now, we were simply following. There was no way to measure progress, no landmark to aim for. There was only the broad, dusty back of the horse in the lead and the silent, shimmering horizon. The pace was maddeningly slow. Buck did not walk in a straight line. He would meander, turning slightly to the east for a quarter of a mile, then correcting to the northwest. He would stop for long periods, his head raised, his nostrils twitching, as if reading a message on the wind that was invisible to us. During these pauses, the settlers would grow restless. "What's he doing now?" someone would mutter from the back of the column. "Is he lost?" The irony was sharp enough to cut. We were questioning if the horse was lost when we were the ones who had no idea where we were. I enforced a new kind of discipline. Not the discipline of the march, but the discipline of patience. "Let him be," I would say, my voice quiet but firm. "He's working. Let him work." The first day of our new journey was the hardest. The water ration was cut again to a mere half cup in the morning and a half cup in the evening. Thirst became a constant, agonizing companion. Every swallow was a torment, just enough to remind the body what it was missing. The children cried, their voices thin and weak. The adults sat in sullen silence, their hope a flickering ember. They followed, but they did not believe. I walked near the front, just behind the Miller wagon. I watched Buck, trying to see what he was seeing. At first, I saw nothing, just the endless expanse of cracked earth and saltbush. But as the hours passed, as my mind quieted from the frantic calculations of distance and time, I began to notice things. I noticed the way Buck would alter his course to follow the faintest traces of game trails, paths worn into the hardpan by creatures who knew this land far better than we did. I saw how he would stop and sniff at the base of a withered creosote bush, his ears swiveling to catch a sound I couldn't hear. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was gathering information. He was reading a map 1,000 times more complex and subtle than the one I had lost. That evening, we made a dry camp. There was no water for the animals, a fact that sat like a stone in my gut. As the families huddled by their small fires, cooking the last of their bacon and beans, a kind of mutinous despair began to bubble to the surface again. Peterson approached me, a small delegation of grim-faced men behind him. "Coleman, this is madness," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We've walked all day and we're no closer to salvation than we were this morning. We're just deeper in this wasteland. We're turning back. At first light, we're heading east to the rocks." I looked at him, at the desperate men behind him. I understood their fear. It was my fear, too. But turning back felt like the greater folly. "The rocks might have shade," I said calmly, "but do they have water? We don't know. All we have is one creature who has been right before. We give him one more day." "And if he's wrong?" Peterson challenged. "We die out here, following a dumb animal's whim." Before I could answer, young Thomas Miller, who had been listening from the shadows, stepped forward. "He's not dumb," the boy said, his small voice clear and steady in the firelight. "He's listening." Peterson looked down at the boy, his anger momentarily deflated by the child's simple conviction. "Listening to what, boy? The ghosts?" "To the earth," Thomas said. He walked over to where Buck stood, a dark shape against the star-dusted sky. The horse lowered his head and nudged the boy, a silent affirmation. The men looked from the boy to the horse, then back to me. My words had not convinced them, but the child's unwavering faith gave them pause. There was a power in that simple, innocent trust that shamed their cynical despair. "One more day," I repeated, my gaze steady on Peterson. "At dawn, we follow the horse. If we have not found anything by sunset tomorrow, we will try for the rocks. Agreed?" Peterson hesitated, then gave a curt, reluctant nod. He and his men retreated back to their own fire, their dissent silenced for now, but not vanquished. I spent much of that night awake, staring up at the brilliant, cold stars. They offered no guidance, no comfort. They were just distant fires in an infinite darkness. I thought about the choice I had made. It was illogical, insane. I had staked everything on an animal's instinct. It was the greatest gamble of my life, far greater than any I had ever taken on a battlefield. If I was wrong, my final failure would not be recorded in a military report. It would be written across the sands of this desert in the bones of 42 men, women, and children. And my own bones would be among them. The second day of following the horse began with a grim, unspoken tension. This was the deadline. If we didn't find water by sunset, the fragile consensus would shatter, and our small band of survivors would likely splinter, each faction chasing its own desperate hope into the wasteland. The sun climbed the sky, seemingly with more intensity than ever before, as if it knew this was our last chance. I had given my word to Peterson, but my own conviction was solidifying. I spent the day walking, not near the lead, but off to the side, trying to learn the language the horse was speaking. I forced myself to stop thinking like a soldier and start thinking like an animal. I stopped looking at the horizon for a destination and started looking at the world immediately around me. The first lesson was the birds. Thomas had been right. A species of small brown finch flew in scattered flocks. I had noticed them before but dismissed them as irrelevant. Now, I watched them with purpose. In the morning, they flew in chattering groups from the north, scattering across the flats. In the late afternoon, they began to gather again, flying back north in a steady, determined stream. They were commuting. They were going to and from a source of water. Buck watched them too. His path, which had seemed so random, was a rough approximation of their evening flight path. He was following the birds. The second lesson was the insects. When we stopped for our brief midday rest, I saw a line of black ants marching resolutely across the baked earth. They weren't carrying food. I knelt down, my knees cracking, and followed their trail. It led from a barely perceptible crack in the ground to the shady side of a small rock. They were seeking moisture, however slight. Buck, I noticed, often stopped near similar rock formations, places where the geology might trap a hint of dampness deep below the surface. The third and most subtle lesson was the land itself. I began to see the desert not as a uniform, hostile void, but as a landscape of infinite, subtle variation. I saw the way the vegetation changed, from the driest, most salt-encrusted flats where nothing grew, to shallow basins where a few hardy, gray-green shrubs clung to life. Buck consistently guided us toward these almost imperceptible depressions. He was following the topography of life, heading for the low ground where water, if it existed at all, would be most likely to gather. He was piecing together a map from 1,000 tiny clues: the flight of a bird, the path of an ant, the color of the soil, the scent of a plant I couldn't even name. It was a living map, rewritten every day by the sun and the wind. My paper map had been a static, arrogant statement of what should be there. The horse was reading the humble, honest truth of what was. By mid-afternoon, the mood in the train was at its lowest ebb. The heat was at its peak. Our last half cup of water was gone. Several people were now too weak to walk and had to be helped into the already crowded wagons. Peterson was walking with his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask. He kept looking at the sun, then at me, tapping his foot impatiently whenever Buck paused. The deadline was approaching. I ignored him. I was completely absorbed in my new study. I felt like a blind man who was beginning to see for the first time. The world was alive with signs, with a silent, complex conversation. And for my entire life, I had been deaf and blind to it. The arrogance of it stunned me. To think we could walk across this ancient land, armed with nothing but a piece of paper and a metal needle, and believe we knew better. Around 4 o'clock, Buck's behavior changed. He stopped meandering. His pace quickened, and he began to walk in a dead straight line to the north. There was a new urgency in his stride. He lifted his head high, his nostrils flaring, pulling the air in deep. He was no longer searching for clues. He had found the main road. A current of excitement, fragile and tentative, passed through the column. "What is it? What's he doing?" people whispered. "He smells something," I said, my own heart beginning to beat faster. I couldn't smell anything but dust and heat, but the horse's entire body was broadcasting a clear, unambiguous message. We are close. He led us on for another mile, his pace never slackening. The landscape began to change more noticeably now. We were entering a wide, shallow basin, and the ground underfoot was less cracked clay and more loose, pebbly stone. A few skeletal, dead trees stood like sentinels, their bare branches reaching for the sky. It did not look promising. It looked, if anything, even more desolate than the land we had just crossed. Peterson came up beside me. "This is it, Coleman," he said, his voice low. "He's led us to a graveyard. Soon as he stops this foolishness, we turn back." I didn't answer. I was watching Buck. He had finally come to a halt in the very center of the basin, a wide, flat expanse of sun-bleached rock and pale, dry soil. There was nothing here. No plants, no birds, no sign of life at all. My heart sank. Had I been wrong? Had I read hope into what was just a random animal's wandering? Buck stood for a moment, surveying the barren ground. Then he lowered his head, and with a deliberateness that sent a shiver down my spine, he lifted his right foreleg and drove his hoof down onto the hard-packed earth. Thud. The sound was dull, final. He did it again. Thud. He had brought us here, to this exact spot, and he was telling us, in the only language he had, that our journey was over. This is it. The spot. The declaration was so absolute, so devoid of doubt, that it silenced all argument. Buck stood in the center of the barren basin, a place that screamed of sterility and death, and refused to move. He just planted his feet, occasionally striking the ground with his hoof as if to say, "Here. Dig here." The settlers gathered around, their faces a canvas of confusion, exhaustion, and flickering, irrational hope. They looked at the bone-dry ground, at the unblinking sun, and at the horse. It made no sense. "There's nothing here," Peterson stated flatly, his voice devoid of its earlier aggression, replaced now by a weary resignation. "It's a dry lake bed. He's a horse. He was wrong." Jedediah Miller walked up to his animal, running a hand down his neck. "He's never done this before," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Never." Thomas, as always, was by Buck's side. The boy knelt down and placed his palm flat on the ground where the horse had struck it. He looked up at his father, then at me. "It's warm," he said. I frowned and knelt beside him, pressing my own hand to the earth. He was right. The surface was hot from the sun, but just beneath it there was a strange, subtle warmth, a difference in temperature that was almost imperceptible. It was bizarre. "So it's warm," Peterson scoffed. "We're in a furnace, of course it's warm. This is a waste of time. We need to go." He turned to the others. "Who's with me? Back to the rocks." A few people shifted their weight, their eyes darting between Peterson and me. They were on a knife's edge. This was the moment of schism. I looked at the horse, standing so patiently, so certain. I thought of the birds, the ants, the subtle language of the land I was only just beginning to learn. My faith in my own reason was shattered, but a new, fragile faith was taking its place. It was a faith in the interconnectedness of things, in a wisdom far older than mankind. I stood up, brushing the dust from my knees. "Get the shovels and the pickaxes," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final command. Peterson stared at me as if I'd finally gone insane. "You want us to dig? Here? In the rock? You'll kill us, wasting the last of our strength on a fool's hope." "The horse brought us here," I said, meeting his gaze. "He's earned our trust. I'm not leaving this spot until I know what's under it." I turned to the others. "We've followed my logic into disaster. Now we follow his instinct. Who is with me?" I picked up a shovel myself. For a moment, no one moved. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Then Jedediah Miller, with a determined set to his jaw, went to his wagon and returned with a heavy pickaxe. "My boy wouldn't be alive if not for this horse," he said simply. "I'm digging." That broke the spell. Cole, the farmer, nodded slowly and went for his shovel. Another man followed, and then another. The women began to organize a shaded spot for the children, using the last of the wagon canvases. Soon a half-dozen men were standing with tools in their hands, looking at me. Peterson watched, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He was a practical man, a man of iron and fire. This was mystic nonsense to him. But he was also a man who understood work. And perhaps, deep down, he was a man who wanted, more than anything, to be proven wrong. With a great, exasperated sigh, he threw his hands up. "Fine," he growled. "Fine. We'll dig your damn hole. But when we find nothing but more rock, don't come crying to me." He grabbed the largest pickaxe, his powerful blacksmith's shoulders squaring for the work ahead. We chose the spot right where Buck had pawed. The first few inches were packed, sun-baked clay, hard as brick. The pickaxe rang against it with a jarring clang. Sweat poured from us, soaking our dusty shirts, dripping from our noses and chins. We worked in shifts, 2 men on the tools, the others clearing the debris, a silent, desperate rhythm of strike and scrape. An hour passed. The hole was now a foot deep. We had found nothing but more clay and shattered, dry rock. The hope that had briefly flared began to dim. The pace of the work slowed. The men's movements became mechanical, their faces grim. "This is useless," one of them panted, throwing his shovel down. "There's nothing here." "Keep digging," I said, my own arms aching, my hands raw. I didn't know why I was so certain. I just was. The horse hadn't moved. He stood nearby, watching our progress, his presence a silent exhortation to keep going. Another hour crawled by. The hole was now nearly 3 feet deep. The sun was beginning its long, slow descent in the west, mocking us. The deadline. Peterson leaned on his pickaxe, his chest heaving. He looked at me, a bitter, triumphant "I told you so" in his eyes. He didn't need to say a word. The failure was obvious. The great gamble had been lost. My brief, insane foray into trusting instinct was over. We were going to die in this hole of our own making. Despair is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It settles, a cold, heavy dust on the soul. It was in the slump of the men's shoulders, the way they avoided looking at each other. It was in the silence from the women and children, huddled under the canvas. The gamble had failed. The horse was just a horse, and I was just a fool who had led them on one last, fatal detour. Peterson threw his pickaxe to the ground. The clang echoed in the basin. "Enough," he said, his voice flat and dead. "We're done. We save what strength we have left and try for the rocks. It's our only chance." No one argued. He was right. It was over. I looked at the hole, a pathetic, shallow scar in the earth. I looked at Buck, who still stood watching, his patience seemingly infinite. I had failed him. I had failed them all. But as I turned to give the order to stop, to admit defeat, young Thomas walked to the edge of the pit. He had a small tin cup in his hand. He knelt down and, with the intense focus of a child at play, began to scrape at the bottom of the hole, scooping the loose dirt and pebbles into his cup and dumping them over the side. "Thomas, son, stop," Jedediah said gently. "It's no use." The boy didn't look up. "Buck isn't leaving," he said, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. He kept digging, his small hands working with a fierce, tireless determination. Something about the sight of that child, refusing to give up, refusing to let despair win, shamed us all. He wasn't digging with the brute strength of the men. He was digging with pure faith. I picked up my shovel again. "The boy is right," I said, my voice hoarse. "The horse hasn't given up. Neither will I." I stepped back into the hole. Peterson stared at me, then at the child, and with a great roar of frustration that was half anger and half agony, he grabbed his pickaxe. "Damn you, Coleman! Damn this whole cursed land!" he yelled, and he swung the pickaxe with all the force of his powerful body. Instead of the hard, ringing clang we had grown used to, the pickaxe head plunged into the bottom of the hole with a dull, wet thunk. We all froze. Peterson stared at the pick, buried halfway up its head in the ground. He worked it loose. When he pulled it out, the iron tip was coated in thick, dark mud. A collective gasp went through the group. No one dared to speak. We scrambled to the edge of the hole, peering in. Where the pick had struck, a tiny dark circle of moisture was spreading, like a drop of ink on paper. With a wild cry, I jumped back into the pit, followed by Jedediah and Peterson. We abandoned the tools and dug with our bare hands, tearing at the soft, muddy earth. It was cool to the touch. The deeper we dug, the wetter it became, until our hands were coated in a thick, blessed slurry. And then we felt it. A trickle. A small, persistent upwelling of water from below. It was real. A cheer went up from the people watching, a ragged, incredulous, joyous sound that cracked with emotion. Men who had been enemies moments before clapped each other on the back. Women were openly weeping, hugging their children. We widened the hole, creating a small basin, and watched in stunned silence as it slowly, miraculously, began to fill with clear, cool water. It wasn't a torrent, but a steady, life-giving seep from the heart of the earth. Thomas was the first to drink, scooping the water with his tin cup and bringing it to his lips, his eyes wide with wonder. Then we all drank, kneeling by the side of our discovery, burying our faces in the pool, letting the water run down our chins and soak our shirts. It was more than just liquid. It was life. It was redemption. After the people had their fill, we brought the animals. They drank deeply, their great sides heaving with relief. Last of all, we brought the dun horse. He walked to the edge of the pool he had led us to, lowered his great head, and drank a long, slow draught. He had saved us. He had delivered on a promise the land itself had made to him. As the horse drank, Thomas stood beside him, his small hand resting on the animal's powerful neck. The boy looked up at me, his face streaked with mud and tears of joy. "He needs a name," Thomas said. "A real one." I looked at the horse, then at the northern horizon we had followed, at the compass in my pocket that had proven so useless. The answer was obvious. It had been there all along. "His name is Compass," I said. The name felt right. It felt true. It settled over the horse like a mantle of honor. He was no longer the miller horse, no longer an anonymous beast of burden. He was Compass, our guide, our savior. In that moment of salvation, born from the barren ground, we were all reborn, and he was finally, truly, named. The discovery of the spring, which we named Compass Creek in honor of its finder, transformed us. We spent 2 full days camped in that basin, and it was a time of healing, both for the body and the spirit. The first priority was water. We drank until we were no longer thirsty, a luxury we had forgotten was possible. We filled every barrel, every canteen, every container we had. We washed the grit from our skin and our clothes. The simple act of being clean felt like a resurrection. The atmosphere in the camp changed completely. The sullen, fearful silence was replaced by quiet conversation, and even, occasionally, the sound of laughter. The deep lines of stress on the faces of the settlers began to soften. They were still weary, but their eyes no longer held the hollow look of the damned. They held a kind of wondering awe. My own role shifted as well. I was no longer the commander whose orders were to be obeyed without question. My authority now came not from a rigid plan, but from a shared experience of humility. The settlers treated me with a new kind of respect, one born not of fear, but of fellowship. We had faced the abyss together, and I had, in the end, chosen the right path by admitting I didn't know the way. Peterson, the blacksmith, underwent the most dramatic change. The day after we found the water, he approached me while I was inspecting a cracked axle on his wagon. I expected a challenge, or at least a grudging remark. Instead, He just stood there for a moment, turning his hat over in his big, calloused hands. "Coleman," he began, his voice rough. I was wrong. About you. About the horse." He looked over to where Compass was grazing peacefully, no longer tethered, but free to roam the small camp. "I'm a man who works with what he can see and touch. Iron, wood, fire. All this, listening to the wind. I thought it was madness." He shook his head. "But that beast, he's more than just a horse." "Yes," I said. "He is." "I was ready to leave you," Peterson admitted, his gaze meeting mine. "Ready to lead folks off on my own. It would have killed us all. Your willingness to trust him, it saved us. I won't forget that." He offered me his hand. It was a peace treaty and an apology. I took it, and in that firm, rough grip, the last of the division in our company was healed. Our journey to the extraction point, a prearranged meeting spot at the edge of the fertile lands, was no longer a desperate march. It became a pilgrimage. We let Compass lead, and we moved with the rhythm of the land. We traveled in the cool of the morning and the late afternoon, resting through the brutal heat of midday. We learned to conserve our energy, to observe the world around us. The children, led by Thomas, became the horse's devoted attendants. They brought him the choicest clumps of grass they could find. They brushed the dust from his coat. They talked to him in low, gentle voices, as if he understood every word. And in a way, I think he did. The final leg of our journey was slow and reflective. The conversations around the campfires at night were different. People spoke of the homes they had left behind and the dreams they had for the future. But they also spoke of the desert. They spoke of its terrifying power, but also of its stark, clean beauty. They had come here seeing it as an obstacle, a void to be crossed and forgotten. They would leave understanding it as a living place, with its own laws, its own language, and its own hidden fountains of grace. They had been stripped of their arrogance. One evening, just a day's travel from our destination, I found myself standing alone with Compass as the moon rose over the horizon. I leaned against his solid, warm side, my hand resting on his neck. The silence between us was comfortable, companionable. "You knew all along, didn't you?" I murmured, not really expecting an answer. "Right from the start." He turned his head and nudged my shoulder, his great, soft eye blinking in the moonlight. In that simple gesture, I felt a sense of profound and ancient wisdom. He hadn't been stubborn. He hadn't been difficult. He had simply been true. True to his nature, true to the world he was a part of. We were the ones who had been stubborn, trying to impose our fragile, paper-thin reality onto a world that cared nothing for our lines and our logic. We had survived not because we had conquered the desert, but because we had finally surrendered to it. We had learned, at the last possible moment, to listen. The last morning of our desert odyssey broke differently. A cool breeze, the first we'd felt in weeks, carried a scent I had almost forgotten, the smell of damp earth, of green, growing things. On the western horizon, the flat, brown line was broken by a hazy, purple smudge of distant mountains, and below them, a faint, dark green line that was not a mirage. It was the edge of the Carson River Valley. It was salvation. A quiet, reverent cheer went through the camp. People pointed, their voices thick with emotion. Children who had been born in the East and had known nothing but plains and desert for months stared in wonder at the sight of so much life. We had made it. The final few miles were a silent procession. The hardships, the fear, the thirst, it all seemed to recede into a dreamlike past. The present was the crunch of our boots on the changing soil, the growing scent of vegetation, the promise of the green line ahead. Compass led us, as always, his pace steady and unhurried. He seemed to know our destination was near, but there was no triumphant surge in his stride. He walked with the same quiet dignity he had shown in the heart of the wasteland. He had done what he was meant to do. The journey for him was the thing, not the arrival. We stopped at the edge of the scrubland, where the pale sand finally gave way to earth that could support sagebrush and hardy grasses. It was a clear, definitive border between the world we were leaving and the world we were entering. The extraction point, a small makeshift settlement where other trails converged, was visible in the distance, a curl of smoke rising in the still air. Our ordeal was over. Before we pressed on to meet the others, I called a halt. The settlers gathered around, their faces turned toward me. They were a different group from the one I had led out of the last settlement. They were thinner, their clothes were in tatters, but their eyes were clear and steady. They were survivors. I didn't have a speech prepared. My words were simple. "We're here," I said, my voice thick. "We're here because we learned to listen. Not to me, but to the land, and to the one who understands it." I gestured to Compass, who stood patiently beside the Miller wagon. "Don't ever forget that lesson. Don't ever forget what this desert taught us about pride and about faith." I looked from face to face, meeting their eyes. "And don't ever forget the horse who led you." No one spoke, but they nodded, a silent, solemn agreement. I walked over to Compass. Thomas was already there, his arms wrapped around the horse's neck, his face buried in his mane, sobbing quietly. It was a goodbye. The Millers, like most families, would have to sell their draft animals to afford a stake of land. Compass's journey with them was likely over. I stood before the horse, feeling a depth of gratitude that was impossible to put into words. This creature had done more than save our lives. He had saved my soul. He had forced me to confront the ghosts of my past, to break the rigid mold of the soldier I had been, and to become something new. He had taught me that true strength isn't about control. It's about the wisdom to know when to surrender it. I reached out and laid my hand on his forehead, between his wide, intelligent eyes. He didn't flinch. He leaned into my touch, his warm breath ghosting across my skin. "Thank you," I whispered. The words were utterly inadequate, a tiny pebble of language dropped into a vast canyon of feeling. The memory of the canyon ambush rose in my mind, but this time it was different. The shame was still there, but it was no longer a crippling weight. It was a scar, a part of who I was. The men I lost there died because of a blind adherence to a flawed plan. The people here, standing on the edge of a new life, were alive because of a leap of faith into the unknown. I had failed my men in that canyon, but in this desert, I had finally, belatedly, honored their memory by learning the lesson their deaths were meant to teach me. In the quiet moment I shared with the horse, I understood. The world provides its own maps, its own guides, if we are only humble enough to see them. My war was over. A new understanding had taken root, here at the edge of the wilderness, thanks to the silent wisdom of an old, nameless horse who was now, and forever, known as Compass. The arrival at the settlement was a blur of noise and confusion. People from other trains, traders and prospectors rushed out to greet us, their faces a mixture of pity and curiosity. We must have been a sorry sight, a ragged band of ghosts emerging from the sun-bleached hell of the Black Rock Desert. They offered us water from barrels that seemed impossibly full, fresh bread, and a barrage of questions. Our story, when it was told in fragmented, emotional pieces by the settlers, was met with wide-eyed disbelief and wonder. The tale of the horse who read the wind and found water in the rock began its journey into legend before we had even unhitched the wagons. I watched the families I had led as they were absorbed into the bustling life of the camp. I saw Peterson, the blacksmith, already deep in conversation with another smith, his hands gesturing, describing the tools he had lost and the forge he planned to build. I saw Sarah Miller weeping in the arms of another woman, the long-held tension finally breaking. I saw their children, our children, laughing as they chased a stray dog, the memory of their thirst already fading. They had been forged into something stronger in that desert crucible. They would bend, but they would not break. My job was done. I collected my pay from the agent who had organized the train, the man's face a mask of astonishment as he listened to my clipped official report. He tried to offer me a bonus, a hardship stipend, he called it. I refused. I had already received my payment. I found Jedediah Miller by his wagon. He was talking to a livestock trader, a hard-faced man with calculating eyes. Compass stood nearby, tied to a post, looking out of place amidst the hustle and noise of the settlement. Jedediah saw me and walked over, his face troubled. "Mr. Coleman," he said, "this man, he's made me an offer for Compass. A good offer, more than I expected. Enough to buy seed and tools." I looked at the horse, then back at Jedediah. I knew this was coming. It was the practical, brutal reality of this new life. "He's a fine animal," I said, my voice neutral. "Strong. He'll fetch a good price." "It ain't right," Jedediah whispered, his gaze fixed on the horse. "After everything he did, selling him off like any other piece of livestock." Thomas was standing a few feet away, his small body rigid, his eyes locked on the trader as if the man were a monster. I had a choice to make. I could walk away, let the logic of commerce run its course, or I could honor the lesson I had learned. I walked over to the trader. I took the pouch of gold coins from my coat, my entire pay for the expedition, and held it out to him. "I'll double your offer," I said. The trader looked at the gold, then at me, then at the horse. A slow, shrewd smile spread across his face. "Mister," he said, "for that kind of money, you can buy any horse in this camp. That one's old. You're making a bad deal." "Just take the money," I said. He did. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, I led Compass away from the noise of the settlement, up to a small rise overlooking the river. The air was cool and sweet. I untied his lead rope, then unbuckled his halter and let it fall to the ground. He was free. He stood for a moment, then lowered his head to graze on the rich grass, his first taste of real pasture in months. I sat on a rock and watched him, my heart full of a quiet, aching peace. The journey had ended, but something new had begun. I was no longer Ezra Coleman, the ex-soldier, the guide who relied on maps. I was just a man, sitting on a hill, watching his horse. In the past, my belief in reason and orders had cost me everything. This time we survived because we had learned to trust something beyond reason, the silent, innate wisdom of a creature who understood the world in a way we never could. We survived because we learned to listen not to the shouts of men, but to the whispers of the earth. Compass lifted his head from the grass, his ears twitching, and looked out across the valley, not toward the settlement, but toward the vast, open wilderness to the east. He took a step, then another, his gait easy and unburdened. He wasn't running away. He was simply choosing his own path. I watched him go, a solitary figure moving through the twilight. I didn't call him back. My hand, which had once held his reins in a grip of iron, was open at my side. I had learned, finally, that the tightest grip is not what keeps you safe. Sometimes, true survival, true freedom, comes only when you have the courage to let go. That journey changed the very ground I walk on. It taught me that the most important maps aren't printed on paper, but are written in the wind, in the flight of birds, and in the deep, silent instincts that connect all living things. It's a hard lesson to hold on to in a world that demands certainty. Have you ever faced a moment where logic told you one thing, but your gut, your instinct, screamed for another? Which path did you choose, And where did it lead you? I wonder how many of us have a compass in our lives, a source of quiet wisdom we too often ignore. Let me know your story in the comments below. Your experiences remind us all that we're part of something much older and wiser than ourselves.